change these over now. Okay. Can I just check everyone can hear me and the microphone is working okay? Level is okay? Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a great honor to be here. What I would like to do today is talk about evolution and talk in particular about the concept of the tree of life. So let's start by thinking about the diversity of life on the planet, and particularly at the moment, what I have here is some pictures of the diversity of animal forms on the planet. And we look at this diversity today, and I don't think we can help but marvel at that diversity, all the different shapes and varieties of animals that there are. But for centuries, people, scientists, philosophers have looked at patterns, have looked at this diversity and tried to make sense of it. So let's go right back in history, first of all, for a couple of hundred years in history. So what I'm showing here is an idea which was very popular a couple of hundred years ago. This is the idea of a scale of nature, where we can arrange a sort of ladder of all the living organisms. So in this ladder here, this one is from this person, Charles Bonnet, who was a Swiss philosopher, and in his version here, he's arranged all the living things. So we have, let's just zoom in, we have reptiles and snakes and fish and birds in a sort of ladder climbing upwards. And you'll notice that he puts monkeys and then humans sitting right at the top of this ladder. Okay? Well, I've cheated a little bit because he put angels and archangels right at the top. But now, that's not the way we think about life on Earth today, not in a ladder-like form. And the reason that I think we've sort of moved away from this ladder-like form is a much better understanding of evolution. And the person who we most associate today, of course, with the idea of evolution and with the concepts of the mechanisms of evolution is this person, Charles Darwin. Now, usually we see pictures of him as an old man with his long beard, the white beard, but actually his really important work was done as a much younger man looking like this. What you can see here in this little diagram is a sketch that he drew in one of his notebooks. He kept many, many notebooks to put all his ideas down. And in one of his notebooks, he drew this little sort of shape like a scrawled tree, like there, where he's come up with the idea that one species can divide into two species, and that could divide into two more species. And if this happens, then surely all living things are related in a branching pattern, rather like a tree. And therefore he's written, I'd like you to notice that, it says, I think, at the top. So he's just had this insight that life on Earth can be arranged in a sort of tree. He wasn't the only person to be thinking like this. The other person that we associated with these ideas is Alfred Russel Wallace. And again, Wallace also independently talked about the idea of living things related in a tree, and he used the metaphor of an oak tree. And this is an oak tree here showing the branching pattern. He was thinking about things being related to each other. So now these two scientists who are both working through around about 1840s to 1860s came up with these ideas of the evolutionary tree. But I want to sort of step back and really think, what were the key insights that they had? And I think there were three key insights. I want to really focus in this lecture on these three ideas. The first one is the idea that all living things are related to each other. Okay, that every living thing on the planet is somehow related to every other living thing. So that you are related to a fungus, and you are related to an ostrich, and a hippopotamus is related to a flower. Everything is somehow related to each other because of evolution. So that's the first insight. The second insight is this metaphor of a tree, that we can think about relationships in the shape of a tree. So that's more of a thought experiment, that it's a very useful way to think about evolution, to think of a tree. And they both came up with that idea. And then the third thing there is a mechanism. Well, I see we've gone 1, 2, 2 as opposed to 1, 2, 3. That's a mutation that's happened there. So they came up with the idea of natural selection, okay, as a mechanism. I'll talk about natural selection a little bit later in this lecture. What I want to do now is I want to take each of these 3 points in turn, and I want to tell you a little bit about what they thought then, 150 years ago. But much more importantly, I want to tell you about what we know today and how the science of evolutionary biology has moved on. So let's start with Charles Darwin, and let's think about the idea, the evidence that things are related to each other. Now, if you read The Origin of Species, published in 1859, about half the book is given over to trying to persuade his readership that everything is related to everything else. Okay, and he gives lots of ways of thinking about that, lots of lines of evidence. So, evidence for evolution. So, the sorts of things he used were, here he was very keen on pigeons. Charles Darwin bred pigeons, and he could see the different forms of pigeons that could be produced by humans breeding them in particular ways. And he recognized, therefore, that within this group of birds, he could see different varieties forming. So that was one of his lines of evidence, thinking, well, if this can happen with humans breeding things, maybe nature can do the same thing. That's one type of evidence. Then, of course, he went on his very famous voyage of the Beagle, this ship that went around the world studying natural history and geology and coming back with lots of ideas. And the sorts of things that, again, Darwin was seeing was related species in different places which had become slightly different. So evidence from biogeography, as we would call it today. Another line of evidence that he introduces in The Origin of Species is embryos. He didn't personally look, but he took evidence from other people's studies, which had shown that if we looked at the embryos of different species, and here we have fish and salamander and tortoise and chicken and pig and cow, etc., the embryos all looked very similar. And he was using this as evidence, saying, well, if they all look very similar, why should they all look very similar? Maybe, again, this is evidence that everything is related to everything. And we can extend that to the idea of homology, which is looking at the structures of, let's say, the skeleton, or indeed any other part of the body, and noticing that as we go through different groups of vertebrates here, here's a horse and a human and a bat, we can see that the bones are arranged in very similar ways. Again, it was to him evidence that everything was related to everything else. So he spent a lot of time in The Origin of Species writing about those things. But what I want us to think about is if Darwin was writing The Origin of Species today, what would he put in the book? I don't think he'd put these sorts of examples in anymore, not because they're not good examples. They are good examples, but we have such better ones today. We have so much evidence that everything is related to everything. I mean, we just think of everything we know about cell biology and biochemistry and the deep relationships of living things. If we think about how what's going on inside a living cell, of which so much has been learned in the last 30 or 40 years, with the nucleus and the DNA being transcribed into RNA, going to ribosomes and making proteins. All this machinery is the same in all living things. So we see the similarities there. There's the famous double helix of DNA itself, which all life depends on. We see this now, we have the evidence that all life on this planet uses these same mechanisms. And here's the genetic code, where the individual bases on this DNA, the individual letters down here, code for particular amino acids in proteins. Again, that genetic code, the code of turning the DNA code into a protein code, is almost the same in every living thing. Just a few very slight changes here and there. So I think if Darwin was writing The Origin of Species today, he'd include things like this as evidence that everything is related to everything. Well, let me give you one more example, which is one that really fascinates me, which is about a set of genes which essentially tell cells where they are in the body of the embryo. So there's a group of genes called Hox genes, and here's a picture of a fly, and in these are the embryos of the fly, and in these embryos, these genes are switched on in particular places, and their job is to tell the cells where they are. Well, that's very interesting, but what's amazing is that those same genes, or equivalent genes, do the same job in us and almost all other animals. So right across this tree of animals here, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a minute, these same genes are used for telling cells where they are along the head-to-tail axis. Again, it's deep evidence of things being related to each other. Let me give you one more example. We need in our embryos that are made of cells. Those cells need to know where they are, not just along the head-to-tail axis, but also the left and the right, and the top and the bottom, okay? Because the cells need to do the right things, make the right things in the embryo. There's a set of genes, don't worry about the names. There's a set of genes in vertebrates, such as in a mouse or a frog, called the cordin gene and the BMP genes, which tell top from bottom, okay? But let's turn this upside down. Those same genes, but upside down, do the same job in a fly or a worm. So it's the same genes again. So again, the same system is being used. But what about this upside-down business? Well, it seems like, essentially, that across the animal kingdom, those same genes are being used, but sometime in evolution, the body turned upside down. As simple as that. So I'm afraid we happen to be upside down. We're our branch here is the unusual one where the body is turned upside down. So this is how we should really draw mice and fish and everything. But I think there are incredible lines of evidence to everything. All these animals are related to each other. So I've said a little bit there about all living things being related to each other and the evidence for that. Let's now talk about trees. Why is the idea of a tree such a powerful metaphor? Why has it lasted so long, and why do we use it all the time when thinking about evolution? There's a couple of reasons, but let me start with the most important one. When we draw a tree, and we draw lines and branches, and we tend to draw them more like this today, rather than this one on the left-hand side, so rather schematic branches, lines that branch, these branching lines lead to the species that we are describing. Okay, so in this particular tree, we have branches coming up here to this jellyfish, a branch up here to a human, etc., with the species on the end of the branches. That's what we mean by a tree. And why is that useful? Well, compare it to a different way of thinking. Compare it to this sort of ladder-like thinking, where we might arrange species in a ladder. The problem with that ladder line of thinking is it artificially makes us think that one species that we've drawn there gave rise to another species, and it didn't. What gave rise to those species are their ancestors, which are now extinct. So the jellyfish did not give rise to the worm, which did not give rise to a beetle, which did not give rise to a human. It's their ancestors that did, their long extinct ancestors. And the tree shows us that beautifully. The tree shows us and helps our mind see that those animals are, all the animals on that tree that we're seeing up here are all alive today. They've all been evolving for the same length of time. So way back in time, down the bottom of this slide, right down the bottom, they shared an ancestor, and they've been evolving for the same length of time for hundreds of millions of years. And the human has been evolving for exactly the same length of time as a jellyfish. Okay, and the tree lets us see that. Okay, that's why it's a really, really useful way of seeing how, of understanding evolution. We do the same by zooming in. Let's zoom into that tree a little bit and look at some primates. So here we have humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and monkeys. Well, the situation's exactly the same. This ladder-like thinking over here on the right-hand side gives us a false impression. The tree shape gives us the real impression that what we're looking at are living animals which have common ancestors which have gone extinct. Okay, so it's a very useful way. But there's a problem with trees. Just one problem, which is that they are very difficult to solve. It's actually very difficult to work out who is related to whom exactly. Okay? And Charles Darwin knew this. This is a very, very interesting quote. Charles Darwin wrote this in a letter to his friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, in 1857. So that's just 2 years before he published The Origin of Species. And Darwin wrote to his friend, "The time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it, when we will have very fairly true genealogical trees, or evolutionary trees, of each great kingdom in nature." So what's interesting about that statement? It's this bit here. I shall not live to see it. He recognized, he was only 48 years old when he wrote that letter. So he wasn't an old man, but he recognized this is a really hard problem to solve. He had evidence that everything was related to everything. He knew that a tree was a fantastic way of thinking about evolution, but actually working out precisely who was related to who on the tree was hard. Now, why is it hard? Well, let's start with some well-known animals. These are vertebrates. Vertebrates are the animals with backbones. So things like sharks and fish and reptiles and birds and mammals. Now, this actually isn't too difficult because there's a lot of structure. If you were to look inside an elephant or a bird or a reptile, you've got all the anatomy, you've got bones that you can compare, etc. You might even have fossils to help you. So it's not too difficult for the vertebrates to work out who's related to whom, to put the names of the species onto a tree. But it becomes much, much more difficult in the invertebrates, the ones without backbones. Things like worms and jellyfish and beetles, etc. Because when we look inside them at their anatomy, they are quite different from each other in terms of how their body is organized. And this meant that for more than 100 years, zoologists argued a great deal about who was related to whom across the invertebrates. They all knew they were related somehow, but precisely, is it the snail that's close to the worm, or is it the worm that's close to the beetle, etc.? Working that out was very difficult. Even more difficult than that are microscopic species, microscopic animals, where there's almost no detailed anatomy to look at. Became very, very difficult. But today it's different. It's different because of this. We have the ability to sequence DNA. What I mean by sequence DNA is we can take the DNA out of an organism, all the genes, and we can read the A, C, G, T, C, G, T, etc., of which there are millions or billions in each species. And that's very, very important information because of this reason here. Through time, these A's, C's, G's, and T's, which make up that double helix of DNA, which is the information content of the DNA, through time, mutations happen. Okay, mutations are errors, such as deletions or changes in this sequence. Now, obviously, as more time goes on, more and more mutations happen, as shown in this diagram. Now, the logical extension of that is any two species which are closer together in the tree, their DNA will be more similar. And as we go further and further apart, their DNA will be more and more different. Now, technically, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's a lot of other things going on. But the principle is exactly that if we can sequence DNA and we sequence the DNA in the genes, we can work out who is related to whom. So, what I want to do now is give you a very, very quick tour of all the animal kingdom, the 2 million species in the animal kingdom, which have been diversifying for 600 million years. I'll try and do that in about 1 minute, but it might take 2 minutes. But it's a beautiful tree, and I really do think we know the tree today. We know the tree based on DNA sequence information. This is the shape of the tree, as I've drawn up there, and I'm going to give you a little walk through the shape of this tree. And if you want more information, I did write a very short book which describes this tree. So let's start. Remember that the tree we're starting in time down the bottom of the tree, and time is going upwards. So we have branches, where these branches on the left-hand side coming up here, these are branches that came off early, but they've been diverging for exactly the same length of time as our branch. And they lead to what we call the basal phyla. What we mean by basal phyla is that their branches came off early. It doesn't mean they are primitive in any way. It means their branches came off early. So what sorts of things are there? Well, they include things like a jellyfish, exhibit A, I'll put over there. So jellyfish. They include things like sponges down here, and some groups of animals which are perhaps less familiar to everybody. So these are the really beautiful comagellies, which are marine organisms that shimmer through the oceans. And down here is a tiny microscopic animal called trichoplax. So those are the 4 groups that make up the basal phyla. That's those ones there. Now we're going to move on to this large branch there, starting down where my arrow points to. This was a very, very important point in evolution, because that is when the evolution of animals invented a front end and a back end, and a top and a bottom and a left and a right. Because things like jellyfish aren't arranged like that. They're much more radial, okay? But at that point, where I put the arrow, evolution invented animals to have a front end and a back end. Now that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but it changed the world. It changed the world because having a front end and a back end means you can move in a directed way. It means that an animal can have sense organs at the front end. It can have a mouth at the front end. Evolution could drive towards having a brain at the front end. It means muscle blocks. It means animals could burrow into the sediments. That changed the ecology of the planet because it started to mix up everything in the sediments of the sea about 550 million years ago. And the animals started being able to hunt. And once animals start to eat other animals by hunting, then defense mechanisms came about. So it's really sort of cascaded a lot of evolutionary events, inventing a front end and a back end. And then that branch split into three. Now, the first one of those branches has a horrendous name, I'm afraid. It's called the Lophotrochozoa. Don't try to remember it. This is the branch which leads to things like octopus, snails, and worms. Okay? The worms are very interesting. Actually, Charles Darwin was fascinated by worms. Charles Darwin wrote many, many books. He didn't just write The Origin of Species. He wrote lots of other books, one of which was called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. This was the last book he wrote, and it was a book he was very famous, very, very proud of writing. But it took him a long time, and in fact, as he was finishing the book, it was taking him so long, again, he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, I really hope, he was very old, he was feeling very ill, and I think he thought he was going to die nearly every day. He was a real hypochondriac. But anyway, he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, I really hope I finish this book on worms before I join them. And he wrote this lovely quote here. It may be doubted whether there are any other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as these lowly creatures. And what he means by that is that they were really important ecologically. Earthworms burrow into the soil and they mix the sediments around. They mix the nutrients around. That's crucial for making soil. And without soil, we wouldn't have trees and forests, etc. Also related to the earthworms, of course, are many other sorts of worms. So we have leeches here, we have polychaetes. Polychaetes are a type of segmented worm which live in the sea, and they're usually predatory, with these jaws like this for catching other sorts of animals, sometimes rather ferocious jaws, don't put your fingers near them. And there are the mollusks, like the octopus I just put the model of, squid, snails, clams, etc. And there's even a mollusk which potentially changed the course of European history, at least, which is in 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed to attack England, and their intention was to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. And if they had been successful, the whole history of the world may have been different. But the Spanish were defeated. And the Spanish were defeated for two reasons. First of all, the English fleet attacked them and fired cannons at them. But they were helped by a snail. They're helped by this small mollusk here called Teredo navalis. This is the shipworm. The shipworm burrows holes in ships. It eats wood. It evolved just to eat wood, trees which have fallen in the sea. And what better source of food than a ship floating through the sea? And the Spanish Armada, it is now known, before attacking England, waited in a harbour in Portugal, getting everything ready. That harbour was completely full of these, which went eating their galleons. So when they sailed to England, essentially the first time a cannonball hit them, they sank because they were full of holes. So there's an important role there that that small snail played. Then we move to this other branch there, the ecdysozoa. In the ecdysozoa, there are things like the arthropods. Arthropods includes insects, so we have there a beetle. It includes things like millipedes and spiders, crabs. So I have a few more exhibits. So here we have insects and a crab. I ate some of these for lunch. Scorpions. So they're the ecdysozoa. There's a few other interesting things. Remember, this tree that I'm showing you is a tree based on DNA sequence evidence. Without that DNA evidence, we wouldn't have known who was related to whom in this tree. But the DNA evidence allows us to go right in and work out some interesting details. For example, it had always been thought, before the DNA analyses, that the insects over here, like this beetle, were very closely related to the millipedes. So and they are within the arthropods, and they are within the ecdysozoa, but how close precisely are they? Well, it now is clear from the DNA evidence that actually the insects are much closer to the crustaceans, like the crabs, and the DNA sequence evidence tells us that. So this DNA is allowing us to get real detail about who's related to whom. Other things in the ecdysozoa include these small nematode worms and very strange microscopic things like this beautiful tardigrade. Then we move on to this other branch. We live with it. We are within that branch. We're now on the deuterostomes, where we are, where we have things like the echinoderms, like starfish and sea urchins, and we have the vertebrates, the things with backbones. So let me bring a few more exhibits over. So we have things like vertebrates, like this bird, and this skate, and starfish. And we can zoom in, of course. As I said, we can zoom right into this tree to get some of the details. So let's look at the mammals, where we are. Before the advent of DNA sequence information, it was known, of course, that all the mammals were together, and it was also pretty clear that a branch came off early, leading to things like the monotremes, that's the duck-billed platypus and co, and then a branch of the marsupials, like kangaroos. But what about the relationships here of all these other mammals, the ones that we call the placental mammals? Well, actually, that was very confusing, but the DNA sequence evidence has resolved that. And we know, I won't go through the branching order, just to show you that they have branched into a number of different groups. And what's beautiful about this tree is that those groups map right onto the continents of the world, as we know as they were breaking up and coming together. So very clearly here, the DNA sequence evidence is showing us which groups of animals emerged on which land masses. Okay, so I've given you that tour of the animal kingdom in terms of the shape of the tree. We can put a little bit more detail onto it like that. This is the same tree with the three branches, ecdysozoa, lophotrochozoa, deuterostomes, and those basal phyla. But let's go step right back now. Let's leave the animals alone and zoom right out into that back of the tree, out of the tree. So we have the animals over here. We can get lots more insights. The DNA sequence data show us very clearly that we are more closely related to a fungus than a fungus is to a flower, for example. So with all those sorts of information has come. Okay, let's move quickly on now to the third point. So I've gone through the evidence that living things are related to each other and all the modern evidence for that today, and the metaphor of a tree, and again, the modern detail that we can put onto that today. But what about natural selection? Well, what is natural selection? Let's remind ourselves the fundamental basis of natural selection. Imagine each of these little circles is an animal within one species. This is one species, and these are individual animals. And then a mutation arises, a change, a variant arises. So that red one is just a little bit different. Nothing too dramatic, just a little bit different. And if that little bit different means that that animal is better suited to its environment, maybe it can run a little bit faster, maybe it can tolerate the temperature change a little bit better, it may leave more offspring and gradually will come to dominate the population. That's all we mean by natural selection. Conceptually, it's a very simple process. But what Darwin didn't know anything about was this part. What are those variants? What do we mean by a variant? Because, of course, Darwin didn't know the basis of inheritance at the time, didn't know about DNA and genes, and that's essentially what we're talking about. We know today that those variants are mutations. They're mutations in DNA, changes to the DNA sequence, and it's those mutations in genes which then get subject to natural selection and ultimately leading to the diversity of the life on the planet. So what sort of mutations are we talking about? We're talking about changes in those sequences of A, C's, G's, and T's. But what I want you to think about is to recognize that within that sequence of DNA, that long sequence of DNA, we have genes, okay? And each gene has a particular job. The whole DNA is not genes. Parts of it are genes. The sorts of changes that those mutations can do, they can change the genes themselves. I'll show you some examples. They can change switches that switch the genes on and off, control the genes, or they can even make new genes. So let's look at changes to genes. Here's an interesting example. This is work done by a scientist called Elaine Ostrander in Washington, D.C. in America, and she's been looking at the DNA of dogs and comparing the different strains of dogs. Now, this is not the differences between different strains of dogs are not due to natural selection, they're due to human selection, but the same principle applies. And what she's been able to find is the mutations responsible for the slightly different attributes of dogs. So she would sequence the DNA of different breeds and then work out the genes that differed between them. So for instance, some dogs have these sort of growths of hair on their face, which are called furnishings, but they're like having a moustache. Some have long, silky hair, some have curly hair. And she's been able to work out precisely which genes have changed in these particular dog breeds. Okay, so if you see a dog with these furnishings, you know that it's got a variant in its gene called R-spondin 2, for example. There is even a breed of dog which has furnishings, long silky hair, and curly hair. And that's called the Portuguese water dog. So if you ever see a Portuguese water dog, you will know exactly what sort of mutations it's got in its DNA. And there's somebody very famous who owns a Portuguese water dog, which is Barack Obama. So next time you see Barack Obama, you can amaze him by telling him about the mutations or variants in the DNA of his dog. Let's move to another example. This is Hong Kong. And if you look at these statues of fish and go to the goldfish market, you will see that they have a twin tail. Okay? This twinned tail. That's very unusual for a fish. A fish doesn't normally have a twin tail like that. So how did this come about? It's a mutation in a gene, and that's been worked out very recently. That it's a mutation in a gene called cordin. So those sorts of mutations can cause those sorts of rather subtle effects. What about changes to switches in genes? Let me give you an example of that. This is work done by David Kingsley, University of California. And he's been working on this species of fish, which is called the three-spined stickleback. It's all one species, but different populations in different parts of the world have very slightly different anatomy. Maybe they're more spiky or less spiky and things like that. And he's been able to work out what the mutations are responsible for that. So let me give you one example. Here's a gene. Don't worry about what it's called. Don't even worry about what it does. It's a gene called PITX1. One of the things it does do is involved in the development of the fins. What I want to show you is that a gene like this shaded it, I want you to imagine that black line going from left to right is the DNA molecule. And one bit of that DNA molecule is the gene, but then those other little black boxes are switches that switch the gene on or off in different places. Okay? And what he's been able to show is that in some of these sticklebacks, there's been a bit of the DNA chopped out and then fused back together, a deletion. A mutation has happened to chop a little bit out, which has chopped out one of those little areas, one of the switches. It just chops out that switch. Now that switch this gene on in the fins. And now the fish, which have that bit of DNA chopped out, don't have the spikiness to the fin. So there's a very precise relationship between a mutation and a variant in morphology. There are other examples, like these very famous light and dark forms of this moth, which is found in Europe, the peppered moth. That, again, that's been shown, that difference has been shown to be a mutation which regulates a gene, switches it on or off. And as I said, there are mutations that generate extra genes as well. These are the ones that I work on personally, but I'm not going to talk to you in detail about those, but we've found we, together with many other people, have found that there's been mutations which generated extra genes on this branch of the tree just here, which is the branch that leads to the vertebrates. Okay, our branch, the branch of the animals with backbones. So a mutation happened there, quite an important mutation, which generated lots of extra genes. So these mutations, these variants, again, are something that we can actually see when we sequence the DNA. So let's sort of step back from what I've been saying and just think again about this question. Why is a tree such a powerful metaphor for thinking about evolution? Why is it an idea that changed the world? Well, I've already given you one reason, which is this one. It gave us this way. It ensured that when we're thinking about the evolution of different species, we're constantly reminded that all these living species today have all been evolving. Ancestors have been evolving for the same length of time, that we're all alive today. It's not a case of one leading into another. I've already given you that one. Let me give you another interesting part about a tree. A tree essentially is sort of fractal. You can zoom into it. Okay, so we can step back from the tree and think of the large branches up here and thinking this large branch goes to the animals, and this large branch goes to the fungi, and this large branch might go to the plants. Or we can zoom further in and we can say on this branch there's a smaller branch that goes to the Basal Phyla, and a branch which goes to the Ecdysozoa, and a branch that goes to the Lophotrochozoa. And then we can zoom further and further into that tree and say, oh, this twig here goes to the humans, and this twig goes to the chimpanzee, and this twig goes to gorilla. So the tree is a beautiful metaphor because of this zooming in, which you can do just by looking at any tree today. And then, of course, the tree also gave us a really good way of interpreting all that information about mutations, the mutations that led to those changes in different species, because it allows us to think, well, that variant which either created a new gene or changed the way a gene was switched on or off, we can place it on a tree. We can put a place where we think those changes happen. So the tree gave us a framework for biological understanding. And I think that biological understanding is essential for understanding just our own place on the planet and understanding how we are related and intimately associated with all the other species on the planet. And I'll stop there. Thank you.